Have you ever felt invisible in a place where you were supposed to feel welcome? Imagine the weight of walking into a school that had always been your dream, only to realize that there, many gazes pass right through you as if you don't belong. This is the reality of Jake, a black teenager who, full of hope, begins his studies at a prestigious institution. However, from the first day, he realizes that the journey will be harder than he imagined. Not because of academic challenges, but because of the looks that judge him, the whispers that surround him, and most of all, those who pretend he simply doesn't exist. The iron gate of Winston High School stood tall and intimidating to anyone who passed by. Jake Williams, a 16-year-old black teenager, paused for a moment before walking through it. It was his first day at one of the most prestigious schools in the city, and despite the happiness of earning a scholarship, something weighed heavily on his chest. Winston High was the kind of school where its hallways exuded prestige and tradition. For most, this would be the start of a promising future. But for Jake, there was a shadow looming over this new phase. He adjusted his backpack on his shoulders and took a deep breath before stepping through the gate. As he walked across the courtyard, he observed groups of students laughing, chatting, all wearing their perfectly clean uniforms. Everyone seemed to be part of something bigger, as if there was an invisible code he didn't have access to. His hesitant footsteps echoed through the school, and soon the stares began. It wasn't the first time Jake noticed these looks, judgments disguised as curiosity, stares that pierced through him as if he were someone out of place. In the classroom, he chose the last seat by the window, hopeful that he could go unnoticed. His mother had always taught him to study hard, to persevere, and not let others' opinions affect him. He repeated these words to himself like a silent mantra as the students around him settled into their seats. The atmosphere felt different. His classmates had known each other for years, and he was the outsider in that perfect world. Jake was trying to focus on his thoughts when the door suddenly opened. A thin man with a stern expression and a piercing gaze walked in. His name was Mr. Harper, the history teacher, known for his strictness and rigid teaching style. As soon as his eyes scanned the room, they paused for a brief moment when he spotted Jake, and a slight sneer formed on his face. Jake noticed it but tried to brush it off. "It's probably just my imagination," he thought. The first weeks passed slowly and heavily. Jake made sure to keep his grades up, but no matter how hard he tried, he always seemed to be ignored. When he raised his hand to answer a question, Mr. Harper deliberately overlooked him, choosing another student even if Jake was the only one with his hand raised. At first he tried to convince himself it was just a coincidence, but soon it became clear it wasn't. Mr. Harper's looks were filled with something deeper, something Jake had felt before in other places but never expected to find in a prestigious school like this. At home, his mother always told him to be strong. "Jake, you're smart, hard-working. They may ignore you, but you'll win through your hard work." He listened to her words carefully, but he knew the battle was internal. Things took a turn for the worse on a cold November morning when history class went in a direction Jake would never forget. Mr. Harper was explaining ancient civilizations, and the class seemed to be going normally until he made a comment that darkened the room's atmosphere. Some civilizations never evolved like others. Perhaps there was a natural limitation in certain races, something that prevented them from progressing. Of course, not everyone is born with the same potential for advancement. Jake felt a knot in his stomach. He knew that rhetoric all too well, the kind of veiled prejudice tossed out as if it were just a simple historical observation. His face flushed with anger, and before he could stop himself, his voice echoed through the room. "With all due respect, sir, I think you're wrong. Africa has a rich history, and many African civilizations contributed to human progress. You can't ignore that." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. All eyes turned to Jake, some surprised, others curious. But Mr. Harper's gaze was pure disdain. He slowly turned to Jake with a cold, calculated smile. "Are you implying that you know more than I do, boy?" His voice was calm, but there was an implicit threat in it. Jake swallowed hard but held his gaze steady. History is written by those in power, and unfortunately for you, some civilizations never reached that level. Jake's heart raced. The humiliation was clear, but there was something more, something that made his breath quicken. He realized, at that moment, this wasn't just a history lesson. It was a silent battle. A battle he had been fighting since he walked through the school gates on that first day. In the hallways, things began to get worse. Some classmates started avoiding him, while others whispered cruel jokes as he passed. Jake, however, decided he wouldn't let it break him. He would stay focused, keep studying, and prove that, regardless of what they thought, he deserved to be there. But fate had other plans for him, and soon, something would happen that even Mr. Harper could never predict. Jake spent the following weeks trying to stay invisible while fighting the suffocating sense of injustice. Every time he looked at Mr. Harper, the history teacher who had become a symbol of something deeper in his life, anger burned in his chest. He had always believed that knowledge was the most powerful weapon, but at Winston High, where prejudice was masked as tradition, Jake began to realize that the barriers were heavier than he imagined. That day, as he walked through the halls, he felt something different in the air. The whispers around him had intensified. Now, the veiled laughter and the words spoken in shadows followed him like a constant echo. Some classmates moved away when they saw him, murmuring to each other as if he carried some kind of invisible stain. He tried to focus, to ignore them, but it was hard. Mr. Harper's words echoed in his mind like an open wound he couldn't heal. Reaching the classroom, Jake found his usual seat in the back, determined to keep his head down, continue his studies, and prove he could overcome any obstacle. He didn't want confrontations, didn't want to be the center of attention for the wrong reasons anymore. But something was about to happen, something he could never have predicted. That day's class started normally. Mr. Harper spoke about the American Revolution, the role of the great leaders, and how the spirit of freedom and independence had shaped the country. Jake, as always, took silent notes. However, everything changed when Harper suddenly shifted the topic. Interestingly, Harper began, with a cold smile on his lips, we don't hear much about the role of black people in the American Revolution. After all, they were slaves, weren't they? Servants. And honestly, they didn't contribute much to the advancement of the nation at that time. If it had been up to them, we wouldn't be where we are today. Jake felt the blood boiling in his veins. The room went silent, and all eyes turned to him, as if waiting for his reaction. He could feel the weight of expectation, the discomfort in the room. His heart was pounding so hard, it felt like everyone could hear it. Without thinking, he raised his hand. This time, he wouldn't wait to be ignored. Mr. Harper, Jake began, his voice trembling with contained anger. That's not true. Many African Americans fought in the Revolution, and they weren't just servants. They were soldiers. They helped shape this country, and their contributions are an essential part of the history of the United States. Ignoring that is erasing a crucial part of our national identity. The silence in the room became unbearable. Harper stared at him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing, filled with something Jake couldn't fully decipher. A mix of disdain and surprise at his boldness. But what Harper did next caught everyone off guard. Oh, of course. There's always one who wants to speak louder than the others, isn't there? Harper's voice was laced with sarcasm. Do you really think you have the authority to correct a teacher with over 20 years of experience, boy? That's typical, isn't it? Always trying to justify the unjustifiable. But tell me, where exactly did you get that information? From books that glorify victories that never happened? Maybe you should spend less time trying to be a hero and more time focusing on your grades, which, by the way, aren't as good as you think. Harper's words hit Jake like a low blow. The weight of public humiliation made his face burn with shame, but there was also something deeper, an ancient anger, an indignation he had been trying to suppress since he entered that school. Before he could think of the consequences, the words left his mouth. "You're a racist," he said, his voice firm, cutting through the heavy air in the room. "I see the way you treat me, the way you look at me, and I hear what you imply between the lines. You shouldn't be teaching." The murmurs started immediately. The shock on some students' faces was evident, but for others, there was a quiet satisfaction, as if they had been waiting for someone to have the courage to confront Harper. The teacher, however, kept his expression cold and distant, but something in his gaze changed. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk, and replied softly, as if he only wanted Jake to hear, "Careful with what you say, boy. Words have consequences." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The tension in the room was palpable. Harper continued the lesson as if nothing had happened, but the atmosphere between him and Jake had changed forever. Jake knew it wouldn't end there. The teacher would ignore him again, humiliate him in more subtle ways. What he didn't know was that the consequences would be greater than he could imagine. That afternoon, as Jake walked home, he was exhausted. Every fiber of his body was tense, as if he were on the verge of collapse. He didn't want to talk to anyone, not even his mother, who always supported him. But something was different that night. His mother was waiting for him in the living room with a serious expression. "Jake," she said, holding a letter in her hands, "I got a call from the school today. The principal wants to meet with you tomorrow." Jake felt his stomach churn. What did that mean? He knew Harper had power, influence, and after the confrontation in the classroom, the situation certainly wasn't in his favor. Was the school calling to reprimand him, or worse, to suspend his scholarship? Jake's mind raced, searching for answers he didn't have. The next morning, with a heavy heart, Jake walked into the principal's office. There, sitting behind a large wooden desk, was Principal Benson, a man with a serious expression but kind eyes. To Jake's surprise, Harper was sitting next to him, arms crossed, his face rigid and emotionless. "Jake," Principal Benson began, gesturing for him to sit down. "I heard about what happened in history class yesterday. We need to talk about it." Jake's throat went dry. The words were stuck, and he knew that, as unfair as it was, he would have to face the consequences of what he had said. Harper looked at him fixedly, like a predator ready to pounce. But Benson, to Jake's surprise, seemed different. He looked from Harper to Jake and then, in a softer tone, asked, "Do you have anything to say before we begin?" Jake took a deep breath. This was his chance. It might be his only opportunity to tell his side of the story, to show who was really being wronged. His future depended on those words. Jake left the principal's office with a heavy heart. During the meeting, despite his attempts to expose Mr. Harper's behavior, he felt like he was fighting against an invisible wall. Principal Benson listened, pondered, and in the end said he would investigate the matter. But the cautious way he dealt with Harper made it clear to Jake that this was just a formality. Harper had influence, years of experience, and a silent respect from the administration. Jake, on the other hand, was just a scholarship student, new, and in the eyes of many, was causing problems. Over the following weeks, things only got worse. Harper seemed to take a perverse pleasure in continuing his behavior, now more subtle, but equally cruel. He would walk past Jake in the hallways without even looking at him. In class, Harper handed out difficult tests, ignoring Jake's questions when he raised his hand for help. It was as if Jake was invisible. Worse than being directly attacked was being erased, reduced to nothing. The students didn't help either. Though some avoided getting involved directly, most followed Harper's lead. When Jake entered the room, the whispers grew louder, muffled laughs followed his steps, and at the slightest mistake or hesitation during a question, the jokes and insinuations intensified. He had become a constant target, but in a way that was almost impossible to prove. No one spoke directly. No one said openly racist words in front of the teachers or the administration, but Jake felt it in every gesture, every look, every silence. There were days when he thought about giving up. The weight of isolation was crushing. His parents told him to stay strong, but even at home, Jake began to close off, feeling that maybe he would never be able to win that battle. Winston High had become a silent battlefield where he fought alone, without witnesses, without allies. Or at least that's what he thought. In the back row of the classroom, almost always invisible to the other students, sat a shy girl with a delicate face and a constantly downcast gaze. Her name was Emma. She wasn't popular, didn't belong to any particular group, and like Jake, went unnoticed by most of her classmates. She rarely spoke to anyone, preferring to lose herself in books or the drawings she made in her notebooks. Jake had never really noticed Emma. To him, she was just another quiet presence in the sea of indifference that surrounded him. But what he didn't know was that Emma had been watching him. From the first day, she had noticed what was happening. Emma knew all too well the pain of being ignored, of being treated as if you didn't exist. And although she didn't share the same experience of racism as Jake, she empathized with him. Something inside her broke every time she saw Mr. Harper humiliate Jake in such a cold and calculated way. Emma had a secret. Every day, hidden in her backpack, she carried a small recorder. It was an old, discreet model that she used to record the lessons. But lately, Emma hadn't just been recording the lessons. She had been recording Harper's veiled provocations, the muffled laughs of the students, and the comments he made while ignoring Jake. She never said a word to anyone. She had no close friends, and her shyness kept her from stepping between Jake and his tormentors. But Emma knew that Harper's words couldn't just disappear into the air, they couldn't be forgotten. While Jake fought alone, she quietly collected evidence, trying to capture every moment of injustice. She didn't know what she would do with these recordings, nor did she have a clear plan. She just knew that what was happening was wrong, and that somehow it couldn't go unpunished. One cold morning, Harper gave an especially difficult test. Jake was determined to do well, despite everything. He had studied for hours the night before, reviewing every detail. But as he worked through the test, he realized there were poorly worded questions, details that didn't make sense. He tried twice to raise his hand and ask for clarification, but Harper blatantly ignored him. While the other students received help, corrections, and even discreet hints, Jake was treated as if he were a ghost. His raised hand didn't even warrant a glance. Emma, from the back row, watched everything. The silence of Jake, the frustrated attempts to get attention, and the way Harper moved around the room, helping everyone except him. She recorded every moment, feeling a growing pain for Jake. Every time he lowered his hand in resignation, she felt as if a small part of him was breaking, and she couldn't understand how Harper didn't see it, or worse, how he saw it and simply didn't care. That night, Jake returned home more exhausted than ever. He had failed the test, not because of a lack of knowledge, but because he had been deliberately prevented from trying. The emptiness he felt was worse than anger. He began to question whether all the effort was worth it. Why fight so hard if no one was willing to see the truth? He could no longer prove anything. Harper was too smart, too manipulative. The provocations were subtle, the humiliations camouflaged as authority. Jake was on the verge of giving in to that suffocating reality. But while Jake was sinking into despair, Emma continued her silent work. Day after day, recording after recording, she collected evidence that slowly formed a horrifying picture. She knew Jake would never be able to convince the school on his own. No one really listened to him. But maybe, just maybe, if she managed to gather everything, those recordings would be enough. Emma didn't know what motivated her. Maybe it was the same loneliness she saw in Jake's eyes, or maybe it was the sense of helplessness they both shared. What she knew, deep down, was that no one should go through that alone. Even if Jake never knew about her help, even if she remained just a silent observer, she was determined to do something. That morning started like any other, with Jake lost in his thoughts as he walked through the halls of Winston High. Despite all the accumulated suffering, he tried to keep his head up. The blank stares of his classmates and Harper's disdain continued to weigh on him, but something inside Jake still fought not to give up. However, what he didn't know was that that day would be different and devastating. Harper had been watching Jake with calculated coldness, his gaze almost predatory, as if waiting for the perfect moment to act. Over the weeks, Harper had orchestrated something even Jake couldn't foresee. He knew he didn't need direct words or blatant insults to bring the boy down. No, Harper was smarter than that. He knew that to make Jake fail for good, he had to push him to the limit, make him destroy himself. After yet another humiliating class, in which Harper ignored Jake's questions about the previous test and spent the entire time smiling at the other students, Jake left the room with a heavy heart. He was tired. The doors of hope were closing every day. Little did he know that the worst was yet to come. In the hallway, a group of boys was already waiting for him. They were the same ones who, for weeks, had tormented him in silence, always making nasty jokes or whispering racial slurs when they thought no one was listening. Led by Ryan, one of the most popular students and close to Harper, they approached Jake with smug smiles. "Hey, Jake," Ryan began, his voice full of false cordiality. "You think you're better than us, huh? Always trying to stand out. Who do you think you are? A hero?" The other boys laughed, their voices echoing through the empty hallways. Jake tried to ignore them, as he had done so many times before. He kept walking, his fists clenched, feeling the anger slowly rise. But Ryan didn't stop. "It must be tough, huh? Knowing you'll never fit in here, you'll never be one of us." Ryan moved closer, shoulder to shoulder with Jake. "You don't belong here, man. No one here wants you. Maybe it's time to give up." The provocation seemed simple, but each word was a sharp blade cutting deep into Jake. He felt the heat of rage rising like a volcano about to erupt. His heart was racing, and his vision began to blur. They wouldn't stop. Subtle shoves, muffled laughs, insults thrown into the air, all perfectly orchestrated. Until now, Jake had managed to hold back, but something in that moment snapped inside him. "Come on, answer, boy!" Ryan nudged him again. Or maybe it's like Harper said. Maybe some people will never know their place. That was enough. Jake lost control. He turned abruptly, his clenched fist finding Ryan's face before he could react. The blow was strong, filled with all the accumulated frustration of the past few months. Ryan stumbled backward, surprised, while the other boys laughed and encouraged the fight. Jake, blinded by rage, struck again, hitting one of Ryan's friends who tried to hold him back. Chaos broke out in the hallway, and within seconds, Jake was in the middle of a physical fight, surrounded by shouts and pushes. What Jake didn't know was that it was all part of a bigger plan. Mr. Harper, from his classroom, had been watching everything from a distance. He had instructed Ryan and his friends to provoke Jake, knowing that if pushed hard enough, the boy would lose control. Harper wanted exactly that. A reason to eliminate Jake from Winston High once and for all. The plan was simple. Make Jake react violently so that the school would have no choice but to expel him. But Jake wasn't alone in that hallway. Emma, the shy girl no one noticed, had left right after Jake and the boys. As always, she carried her recorder in her bag. When she saw Ryan and the others start the provocations, something inside her told her to record. She didn't know what she would do with it, but she felt she needed to capture what was about to happen. When things spiraled out of control and the fight broke out, Emma recorded everything. She saw Jake losing his temper, but she also clearly heard every insult, every provocation made by Ryan and his group. They wanted Jake to react. They wanted to force an irreversible situation. And the most frightening thing was what Emma saw next. Harper was standing in the hallway, hidden in the shadow of a door, watching the scene with a discreet smile. He gave a slight nod to Ryan, a signal that the plan had worked. Emma froze, unable to believe what she was seeing. Harper, the teacher who was supposed to be a moral and just example, had orchestrated everything, and now he watched with satisfaction as Jake, completely out of control, got involved in a fight that could ruin his future. Before Emma could do anything, shouts and quick footsteps echoed down the hallway. Principal Benson appeared, followed by Harper, who now wore an expression of calculated indignation. "What's going on here?" The principal separated the students, pushing Jake away from Ryan and his friends, who now wore innocent and bruised faces. Jake, still panting, tried to explain, but the words came out jumbled. He looked at Harper, hoping for some explanation or at least justice. However, the teacher calmly approached the principal and, with a sigh, said, "I knew this would happen sooner or later. I tried to warn, but unfortunately some students just don't know how to control themselves." Jake felt as if he had been hit again. Harper had planned everything, and now he was about to reap the benefits of his manipulation. The principal, visibly disappointed, looked at Jake with a look of pity. "Jake," Benson began, his voice grave, "this is unacceptable. We have a zero-tolerance policy for violence in the school. The situation is very serious, and given what happened, you may lose your scholarship. We'll schedule a meeting with your parents, but expulsion is a very real possibility." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. His world was crumbling before his eyes. Harper had won, but Emma was there, silently watching everything. And she had what no one else had, the truth recorded. She had seen the teacher manipulate the situation and knew she couldn't let Jake fall for something he didn't provoke alone. She held the recording in her hands, and now, what would she do with it? Jake's fate was hanging by a thread, and only Emma could change the course of this story. Jake sat with his head down, his body still trembling with rage and frustration. He could barely believe what was happening. Principal Benson's words, filled with disappointment, echoed in his mind. Expulsion. He would lose his scholarship. The future he and his family had sacrificed so much for was about to be ripped away from him. All because he fell into Harper's trap, a teacher who had clearly planned his downfall. Ryan and his friends looked triumphant, as if they had won a battle they knew had been manipulated. They smiled discreetly, showing their fake bruises, while Ryan complained to Harper, pretending to be the victim. Harper, with his calculated demeanor, looked at the principal and then at Jake, as if to say, "I told you so." Jake couldn't say anything. He was lost, confused, unable to defend himself against something he knew was unjust, but now seemed irreversible. Emma stood in the background, her heart racing, her hands sweating as she held the recorder inside her backpack. Her small body was motionless, but inside her, a storm was raging. She knew what she had to do. She knew those recordings were the only thing that could save Jake, the only real evidence that would show he had been provoked, that Harper had manipulated the situation, and that his classmates were the real culprits. But Emma hesitated. She had always been a girl who stayed invisible, someone who never liked getting involved, drawing attention. Intervening would mean exposing herself, putting herself in the middle of a tense and dramatic situation. Her silence protected her. But now, that silence was destroying Jake. And for the first time, Emma realized that her decision wasn't just about saving someone else. It was about saving herself from the apathy and cowardice that had always followed her. Jake was taken to the principal's office, accompanied by Harper and Benson, while the other students stayed behind. Emma followed from a distance, her steps hesitant, but her heart firm. She heard Harper murmuring quietly to the principal, words like lack of control, immaturity, and, unfortunately, predictable. It was all part of the plan. Harper was planting the seed of guilt in the principal's mind, forcing him to see Jake as the only villain in the story. Emma knew she didn't have much time. In the meeting with Jake's parents, Harper would likely finish the job he had started. The chances of expulsion were almost certain. But she had the recordings. She knew the truth was there, in her backpack, waiting to be revealed, and this time she couldn't stay silent. Inside the principal's office, Jake sat in a chair, staring at the white walls with fixed eyes, trying to process everything that was happening. Harper stood with his arms crossed, with an expression of thinly veiled superiority. Principal Benson was seated in his leather chair, massaging his temples as if trying to find a way to resolve the situation fairly. But Harper's implacable presence made any impartial decision almost impossible. Before the principal could open his mouth to deliver the final verdict, a soft knock on the door interrupted the silence. Emma stood there, pale, her large, serious eyes holding tightly to her backpack. Harper, upon seeing her, frowned, clearly irritated by the interruption. "Emma," the principal said, surprised to see her. "Do you need something? We're in the middle of an important meeting." She hesitated for a second, but knew she couldn't turn back now. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. I need to speak with you, Principal, about what happened in the hallway," Emma said, her voice low but clear. Everyone in the room went silent. Harper looked at her with disdain, as if her mere presence was an inconvenience. Jake lifted his head, surprised to see her there. He barely knew Emma. They had never exchanged many words, and he certainly didn't expect her to have any reason to get involved. "Emma, now isn't the best time," Harper quickly interjected, trying to shut the situation down before it gained momentum. "This matter is already being handled." But Emma didn't back down. She pulled the recorder from her backpack and held it in her trembling hands. "I recorded everything," she said, her words making the air in the room feel even heavier. "I recorded the provocations. I recorded what Ryan and the others said to Jake. I recorded their plan, and I recorded you, Mr. Harper, watching everything." Harper paled, his words dying in his throat. Principal Benson's eyes widened in surprise at what he had just heard. Jake's heart skipped a beat, not believing what Emma had just revealed. The truth, which he thought would never be proven, was now in the hands of the girl he barely knew, but who somehow was willing to stand up for him. "What?" Harper murmured, trying to regain control of the situation. "This girl must be confused. She doesn't know what she's talking about." But Emma stood firm. She held out the recorder to Principal Benson, her hands still trembling but her voice determined. "I recorded you, Mr. Harper," she repeated, looking directly at the man who had been manipulating and destroying Jake's life for weeks. "And the principal needs to hear it." Principal Benson, still stunned, took the recorder and, without saying a word, pressed play. The sound filled the room, echoing with the voices of Ryan and his friends, insulting and provoking Jake, laughing, planning to force a reaction. Then, the sound of Harper murmuring softly while making the gesture Emma had seen, the signal that the plan was working. The room became still. Jake watched as Harper's expression slowly shifted from confidence to panic. The teacher tried to speak, to open his mouth to defend himself, but the truth was already there, plain and undeniable, and there was no way to erase it. Principal Benson, incredulous, stopped the recording and stared at Harper with a mixture of shock and anger. Is this for real?" The principal shook his head, as if trying to process what he had just heard. "You manipulated this situation." Harper tried to pull himself together, but his words came out rushed and uncoordinated. This isn't what it seems. She's interpreting everything wrong." But Benson wasn't listening anymore. He looked at Jake, whose expression was one of pure relief mixed with disbelief. For the first time, someone believed him. Someone saw the truth. The principal, with a heavy sigh, stood up. "Jake, go home. We'll handle this. But from what I've just heard, you won't lose your scholarship. And Harper, we'll have a very serious conversation." Jake felt the weight he had been carrying for weeks lifted in an instant. He looked at Emma, who was still standing by the door, unsure how to react. They exchanged a silent look, and without needing to say anything, Jake knew that without her, everything would have been lost. The silence after the recording played was suffocating. Jake sat with his head down, processing the revelation that changed everything. Mr. Harper, the teacher who had been manipulating situations to destroy him for weeks, was now exposed before Principal Benson. The shock and disappointment on the principal's face were evident. Harper, on the other hand, stood frozen, pale, his eyes fixed on a distant point, as if trying to understand what had just happened. The recorder was still in Principal Benson's hands, his words filled with disbelief. He looked at Harper with a look of disgust, as if the man standing before him had betrayed not just the school, but the very principles he was supposed to uphold as a teacher. "This is unacceptable," Benson finally said, his voice low but filled with anger. You, a teacher with years of experience, someone we trusted, manipulated your students, used your position to incite hate and violence, and even tried to destroy a student's future. This goes against everything we stand for at this school. Jake slowly lifted his head, his eyes meeting Harper's. He saw in the man who had always humiliated him a flicker of fear, as if the armor of power and control Harper always wore had begun to crack. But despite the clear guilt, Harper tried to defend himself. "Principal," Harper began, his voice trembling. "You're misunderstanding this. I was trying to discipline Jake. He's always been disobedient, never adapted to the school's rules. The other students were just trying to protect him from what, Harper?" Benson interrupted, with a firmness that made the whole room tremble. "Jake has never been a threat. He's a student who has been trying hard despite the difficulties you've put in his way. And now, with these recordings, it's clear that you provoked him, that you orchestrated this situation so that he would lose control. This isn't discipline. This is cruelty." Silence returned to the room for a moment, until Benson took a deep breath and made a decision that would bring justice once and for all. "I can't allow you to continue at this school, Harper," he said, his eyes fixed on the teacher, whose expression of fear intensified. "This not only goes against all the ethical principles we uphold here, but it's also a crime. Manipulating students, fostering racism, and covering it up with your power. This won't go unpunished." Benson picked up the phone from the desk, his hands steady. "I'm calling the police. You'll answer for your actions in court." Panic spread across Harper's face. He tried to argue, now desperate. "Please, don't do this. I made a mistake, but calling the police, that will ruin my career. I can make this right. I can apologize." "An apology isn't enough," Benson responded coldly. "What you did here is too serious to be swept under the rug. This school will never allow racism or any kind of oppression to flourish without consequences. You will pay for what you've done." Harper stood paralyzed, unable to respond as Benson dialed the number for the police. A few minutes later, officers arrived at the school. Harper was taken away in handcuffs, the murmurs of students and teachers filling the hallway as they witnessed the scene. Jake, watching from afar, felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. He never imagined he would see justice served so clearly and decisively, and it was all thanks to Emma. Emma, who had stood by the door the entire time, watched silently, her wide eyes still processing the impact of what had just happened. She didn't want to be the hero of the story, didn't want to be the center of attention, but now she knew she had been the key to bringing the truth to light. Before she could slip away quietly, Principal Benson approached her with a soft, understanding look. "Emma, what you did was incredible. You saved Jake, saved his reputation, and brought the truth to light. That takes a lot of courage." She lowered her eyes, feeling the weight of the whole situation. I just did what I thought was right," Emma said, her voice soft. "But I don't want anyone to know it was me. I don't want to be exposed. I'd prefer if this stayed a secret." Benson nodded respectfully. "Of course, I'll make sure your identity is protected. But know that you did something important, something that changed lives, and Jake is very lucky to have someone like you by his side." Emma just nodded, shy, but inside she felt a small relief. She wasn't looking for recognition, but knowing that Jake was safe and that Harper would face the consequences was enough for her. That night, Jake returned home with a whirlwind of emotions. When he told his mother everything, the humiliation, Harper's plan, the students' provocations, and finally Emma's revelation with the recordings, his mother listened with tears in her eyes. She had always known her son faced enormous challenges, but hearing the depth of the suffering he had endured made her feel a mix of sadness and pride. "Jake," she said, pulling him into a tight hug, "you're stronger than I ever imagined. To go through all of that and still keep fighting. It shows the man you're becoming. But knowing that justice was done, that man will pay for what he did, it's such a relief. And that girl, Emma, she's an angel in your life." Jake, feeling the warmth of his mother's embrace, Let the tears he had been holding back for so long finally flow. "I thought I was alone, Mom. I thought there was no way out, that Harper would destroy me. But Emma, she was there the whole time. She saved me." The following days brought a definitive change to Winston High. Harper's arrest and his dismissal sent ripples through the school, and Principal Benson decided it was the perfect opportunity to promote a deep transformation. He initiated anti-racism campaigns with lectures and workshops, encouraging dialogue about respect, diversity, and empathy. The school, which once seemed stifled by a silent tradition of prejudice, began to breathe new air. Jake, now free from Harper's constant pressure and his provocateurs, blossomed like never before. His talents, especially in mathematics, shone. He started participating in school competitions and quickly gained recognition, accumulating medals and awards in national contests. Every victory he achieved was a silent testimony to his strength and resilience, and an answer to those who had doubted his potential. Emma, despite maintaining her shyness, became a constant figure in Jake's life. They became best friends, inseparable. While Jake excelled academically, Emma was always by his side, offering quiet and discreet support, but always present. Their friendship grew stronger every day, and Jake knew that without Emma, he would never have been able to move forward. She was the safe harbor in the storm he had faced. The atmosphere at the school also changed. The students, once so influenced by Harper's toxic behavior, began to open their eyes to the importance of mutual respect. Jake's classmates, who had once laughed or distanced themselves from him, now deeply respected him. Many even approached to apologize for not doing anything while he suffered. Winston High was no longer the place of isolation that Jake had known. It had become a more welcoming and respectful environment. At the end of that year, the school organized a special ceremony to recognize the students' achievements. Jake was called to the stage several times to receive academic awards, especially in mathematics. As the audience gave him a standing ovation, he looked to the front row and found Emma, smiling quietly, her eyes shining with pride. When the ceremony ended, Jake and Emma walked together through the school hallways. The place that once felt like a battlefield was now more welcoming, lighter. They talked about the future, making plans for the competitions and challenges of the next year. Their friendship, built amidst difficulties, was now indestructible. "I'll never forget what you did for me, Emma," Jake said sincerely. "You gave me a second chance. Without you, I would have lost everything." Emma smiled, her eyes glowing with the same shyness as always, but with a renewed confidence. "You would have done the same for me, Jake. I know it." They walked down the hallway together, heads held high, ready to face any challenge the future might bring. Jake knew that with Emma by his side, there was no battle he couldn't win.